Donald Trump's inauguration speech shocked many people. He promised to bring the Panama Canal back under United States control. He called it stupid. It was one of the most expensive construction projects in American history. The world held its breath, waiting for what could become a new conflict. A conflict over a vital shipping route that billions of people depend on. Today, we will break down why America's project is filled with manipulation, disappointment, failure, and tragedy, and why Donald Trump is so determined to take it back. For thousands of years, the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans were separated by a narrow strip of land, just over 80 kilometers wide, the Isthmus of Panama. But for sailors, it was an impossible barrier. To move between oceans, ships had to sail around an entire continent, through the storms of Cape Horn, adding thousands of kilometers to the journey, or they had to unload cargo, carry it across land, and load it onto another ship. It was slow, expensive, and dangerous, and so humanity chose to cut through the planet itself. It all began in 1513. Spanish conquistador Vasco Núñez de Balboa became the first European to see the Pacific Ocean. He found a land route across the isthmus. It started at the Gulf of Panama, on the Pacific side, and stretched all the way to the Caribbean coast. The path was already used by indigenous people, but the Spanish improved it and gave it a name, the Royal Road. It was used to transport treasure from South America to Europe. The first ideas for a canal appeared as early as the 10th century. However, later the King of Spain, Philip II, who controlled Panama at the time, banned such projects for religious reasons. He believed that what God had joined together, man must not divide. It was only in 1821 that Gran Colombia, which included Panama, gained independence from Spain. At the beginning of the 19th century, global trade was growing rapidly. It became clear that the old trade routes were no longer sufficient. Building a canal remained too difficult. So an alternative solution was chosen: a railway. After the gold rush, a 75-kilometre railway was built, and it became the first step toward the construction of the Panama Canal. The railway was an engineering marvel of its time. It was built under extremely harsh conditions. Up to 10,000 people died during its construction. Most died from disease and accidents. The railway operated intensively, but by the end of the 19th century it could no longer meet demand. Transportation needs kept growing, and the idea of a canal came back into focus. In the United States, they were considering building a canal in Nicaragua. France, however, chose Panama. In 1880, Ferdinand de Lesseps stepped onto the shores of Panama, a living legend, the man behind the Suez Canal. But this time, it wasn't a state project. Lesseps bought a concession from the Colombian government. Colombia remained the true owner of the land. The money didn't come from the state. It came from ordinary people. The hype was massive. Over 800,000 investors, inspired by the success of the Suez Canal, believing in easy profit, but their faith in Lesseps was misplaced. By 1888, $300 million had been spent, nearly twice the original estimate, and only 1/3 of the work was done. Lesseps made a fatal mistake. Blinded by his success in Egypt, he ignored the realities of Panama. He insisted on a sea-level canal, no locks. But Panama was no desert. There were solid rock formations and the wild Chagres River. But the real enemy wasn't rock. It was disease, malaria. Workers would fall asleep healthy and wake up with fever and yellow eyes. Back then, no one knew the cause. To fight insects, the French placed bowls of water, only making things worse. The mosquito population exploded. Desperate to keep the project alive, its leaders turned to corruption. Bribes flowed to ministers, to journalists, to anyone who could buy them more time. They brought in Gustave Eiffel to design and build the locks, a last hope to save the project. But even that hope was tainted. Much of the funding meant for the work simply disappeared, lost within a web of corruption and deceit. In 1889, the financial pyramid collapsed. The Panama scandal became a national disgrace. Everyone was put on trial. Lesseps' son was convicted, Eiffel was found guilty of fraud. Lesseps himself avoided prison. The French effort ended in disaster, a bankrupt nation, and 22,000 graves. After the French failure, the United States stepped in. President Theodore Roosevelt understood one thing: the Isthmus of Panama was a gold mine for global trade. At the time, Panama was part of it. The US made an offer to Colombia, $10 million up front and $250,000 a year for a land lease, but the response was simple: not enough. Colombia decided to bargain with a rising superpower. It was a fatal mistake. Roosevelt didn't raise the offer. He changed the rules of the game. A civil war had just ended in Panama, but most citizens were outraged by its outcome. That was Roosevelt's opportunity. He used the situation to achieve his goal, and soon a new uprising began in Panama, organized with support from the United States. Their path was blocked by the US Navy. On both sides of the isthmus, American warships. The uprising succeeded, and the United States quickly recognized Panama's independence. The new government signed a treaty with the United States. Under its terms, America received full control over the canal, in exchange for the same financial conditions that had been offered to Colombia. Colombia was furious, but the United States had given Panama such strong security guarantees that Colombia could no longer do anything about it. Before they could start the excavators, the Americans had to win a war the French had lost, a war against disease. This medical front was led by William Gorgas. He didn't rely on guesswork. He followed the research of Carlos Finley. The real killer was the mosquito. But how do you stop billions of insects in the middle of a jungle? Gorgas launched a massive operation on a scale never seen before. They cut down and burned entire areas of vegetation, over 30 square kilometers. They drained swamps, dozens of hectares. They dug miles of drainage canals. Every pool of standing water was treated. Hundreds of tons of oil spread across the surface, a thin film that suffocated mosquito larvae. The drop in infection rates was not just a medical success, it was essential for the canal's construction. Without this breakthrough, the workforce would have continued to die at an unsustainable rate. And at that moment, the most difficult phase began, the one that would define the Panama Canal as we know it. When the deadly diseases were finally brought under control, construction was taken over by John Stevens. Stevens was a brilliant railroad engineer. Still, he convinced Roosevelt a sea-level canal was impossible. Locks were the only solution. But he had limited experience in building locks and dams. After 3 years, he was exhausted by the complexity of the task, and he resigned. Leadership passed to Army engineer George Goethals. He brought strict discipline and full control. Construction became precise, almost mechanical, but the cost was extreme. The hardest obstacle was the Culebra Cut. They carved through solid rock, day and night. Explosions never stopped. Millions of tons of earth were removed. The ground kept collapsing. Constant landslides would bury months of work overnight. Nature kept fighting back, but slowly the cut was completed. The key elements of the canal were the locks and a massive dam. Learning from French mistakes, the Americans built a huge dam. It formed Gatun Lake. At the time, it was the largest man-made lake in the world. They also constructed a system of locks. It became a water bridge. Ships were lifted 26 meters above sea level. Construction took 10 years. But behind this engineering achievement lay a human tragedy. Around 75,000 people worked on the project. They lived in harsh conditions. They earned just $1 a day. Strict racism and discrimination dominated the workforce. Despite major medical progress, about 5,500 workers died. The final moment came on October 10th, 1913. President Woodrow Wilson, in the White House, pressed a symbolic gold-plated button. An electrical signal travelled 4,000 kilometres. It detonated 20 tons of dynamite near Gamboa. The final barrier fell. the waters of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans finally met. A project that cost $400 million and thousands of lives became reality. In August 1914, the steamship Ancon became the first vessel to pass through the canal. It was a complete triumph of American will and capital. For Panama, it was a ticket to the top tier of global logistics. But there was one problem: sovereignty. Washington acted in the canal zone, as if it were its own territory. It appointed its own administration, built military bases, and even constructed a wall around the canal area. This deeply angered many Panamanians. In 1977, Jimmy Carter and Panamanian leader Omar Torrijos signed a historic agreement. The United States pledged to gradually transfer control of the canal. Finally, in 1999, Panama gained full control, ending nearly a century of US dominance. The canal was never static. It always had limitations, especially in ship size. For a long time, the standard was Panamax vessels. They were designed specifically for the original locks, but global trade kept growing, and ships kept getting larger. In 2016, the canal was expanded. New larger locks were built. This allowed much bigger vessels to pass through, Neo-Panamax ships. In effect, the canal was given a second life. But even today, the balance remains fragile. The canal's main resource is fresh water. Without enough rainfall, transit capacity decreases. Each passage uses water that eventually flows into the ocean. That's why water resources here are strictly managed and controlled. Today, about 5% of global trade passes through the canal. Demand is extremely high. Transit slots are booked in advance. The cost of a single passage can reach hundreds of thousands of dollars. And here, a new chapter begins. Donald Trump criticized the canal fees, calling them unfair. But the real issue goes deeper. China has become one of the canal's largest users. Chinese companies now operate key ports, Balboa and Cristobal, and continue investing billions into Panama's infrastructure. The United States once again sees its influence in the region being tested. Will we see a renewed American presence in Panama, or will China continue expanding its role in one of the world's most important trade arteries?